Have you ever been frustrated when listening back to your final mix, feeling disappointed when it doesn't sound as good as other professional mixers do? After spending hours tweaking your mix, trying different plugins and adding effects to your tracks, just to end up with a worse sounding mix than what you originally started with can be really discouraging. And I can say with experience that I know that feeling all too well, which is why I want to share the solution with you to help fix all these issues. And the biggest problem that causes these issues always lies within the workflow. So in this video, I'm going to share with you my top tips for creating a better mixing workflow, and if you stick around until the end of the video, you'll find out why your master bus chain could be holding you back from creating professional sounding mixes. By following these mixing tips, you'll set yourself up for success every time, so let me show you how. But before we start, if you want to get your mixes to sound like professional songs, I highly recommend checking out Sage Audio's Mixing and Mastering membership. As a member, I have to say the experience is incredible. Just for signing up, you receive 10 free mastered songs per month with your own dedicated mastering engineer, unlimited mixing feedback, and access to Sage Audio University for in-depth mixing and mastering education courses. But more on that at the end of the video. Let's first start with a short listening exercise. I'm going to play my mix back, and I want you to make notes in the comments of what you hear and what you would change or alter if you were to mix this track yourself. If you were like most mixing engineers, you probably focused in on tiny details that you didn't like, or immediately went looking for issues within the different tracks, thinking of ways you could fix these sounds. Which leads me to my first workflow tip, which is to mix from a listener's perspective. If you don't quite know what I mean by this, let me show you instead. I'm going to play the chorus section of my mix, and I want you to make notes of what you think are the most important elements within this section of the song, or in other words, the focal points of the mix.
And when the rain comes down, crashes to the ground, I try again and again to express myself, but it's pointless in the...
This chorus really has three main focal points that will draw the listener's attention in, those being the lead vocal track, the kick drum, and the snare. Everything else that's going on is just background information to help support these three focal points. So now that you know this, let's take a listen to this section again and try to listen in a more casual way, like how most people would listen to your own mixes.
And when the rain comes down, crashes to the ground, I try again and again to express myself, but it's pointless in the...
Hopefully after this second playthrough, these focal points are now crystal clear to you. In any mix you have, assuming it's already been well arranged, sections should only have 1 to 3 focal points happening within any given part. Any more than this, and a listener will struggle to enjoy your mix. If you've ever received feedback that your mixes sound cluttered or busy, this is probably the reason why. Even if the track you've been given to mix hasn't been well arranged, as mixing engineers, we have the ability to help better shape a track for our client. And a way that you can do this is by noting down what you hear from a listener's perspective as being the most important elements in any given song section, and then mixing this in a way to make sure that these focal points are always at the forefront of your mix, never being obscured or buried under less important background information. So what else can we do to always ensure that these focal points stay at the forefront of our mixes? Well, this brings me on to my second workflow tip, which is all about setting up your session for a success by building a template that works for you. Every successful mixing engineer will use a template in one form or another, whether that's having all their go-to plugins and chains preloaded into their session, or just a simple color-coded project that's clearly labeled and easy to follow. The worst thing that you can do when starting a new mix is to throw all of your tracks into a blank project and just start mixing. If there's no organization to your mix, you can easily get lost and lose sight of making the key elements in your mix shine through. So if I open up my mixing session, you can see that I have everything organized into folders, one for each key instrument of my mix, along with every track in the session being color-coded for these specific folders. So as I scroll down, you'll see that all of my drums are colored blue, my bass tracks are all in yellow, guitars are red, and so on. As I keep all of these colors the same from session to session, I can quickly look at my mix and instantly know what types of tracks make up any given session. Then when mixing, I can quickly solo out certain sections like the bass here, or mute out the drums if I want to focus on how my bass and guitars sound together. From a visual standpoint, this simplifies the mixing process. I can quickly see what elements make up the entirety of my mix, just from the color coding alone, which gives me a good overview of what instruments are likely to make up the foreground and background elements of my mix, all before I've even moved a single fader. To set up your session like this, first think about the typical tracks you often mix. This may vary depending on the genres you work in. For me, it'll usually be drums, post-production, bass, guitars, keys, and vocals. So I'll first create tracks for these 5 key instruments. These will become our folders. This may be called something different in your own DAW, but most DAWs will give you an option to do this. If you're unable to do this, you could instead create 5 bus tracks and use these as your folders instead. So label these accordingly, and then you can create some blank tracks to place within each folder. Then when you're mixing a large session, you can collapse these down to show only your folders, helping to give you a clear visual representation of your mix and its key elements. I also like to keep the same names in my tracks in every session, regardless of who I'm mixing for. This helps me to know exactly what the track is, instead of having some random name like Kick Drum 24 or Verse Guitar with reverb and delay. Much like my point about color coding, this makes things easier and clearer to follow from a visual standpoint, and will translate over to any song you mix, so long as you follow the same organizational layout in every session. This brings me on to my final workflow tip, which ties directly into my previous point about template mixing and building out a template that you can get used to. So in the same way that you want to stick to using the same template for every mix, it's also a good idea to build out a master bus chain you're comfortable using on every mix you work on. By creating a flexible mastering chain that you know the sound of, you can quickly simplify the entire mixing process, eventually being able to mix through this chain earlier on in the mixing process and not having to rely as much on smaller individual moves throughout your mix. Every great mixing engineer will have their own personal master bus chain that they like and know how to use, so it's really about finding what works best for you. As a starting point, I'd recommend a simple setup utilizing these 4 types of processing. Firstly, pick an EQ that you're comfortable using. This can be anything from a simple parametric EQ to a more advanced mastering EQ. You're not likely to be doing big moves with this, so choosing something that you're used to will always be best here. Next up, you want to pick a compressor. Now there's many different types of compressors out there, all of which have their pros and cons when it comes to using them on the master bus. Personally, I really like VCA style compression on my master bus, which is why I normally go for something that mimics an SSL compressor. Because I mix a lot of dense sounding rock tracks, I found that these settings work on almost every song. Instead of doing the standard slow attack and auto release with the lowest ratio setting possible, instead I prefer quite a fast attack time set at 0.3 on this compressor, along with the fastest release time possible at 0.1 and a slightly higher ratio of 4:1. It's important to note that I usually mix through this compressor pretty early on in the mixing process, so if you're newer to mixing, you may want to start out with something that's a little more subtle sounding. But for me, this really helps to shape the drum sound in my mix, along with adding a pleasing pumping sound to the overall mix. And after this, you want to use a clipper. Clippers are used to round off the very peaks of your mix, enabling you to push the mix further into a limiter to achieve your desired loudness level. Clippers come in a lot of different forms, from some very simple designs with few options to ones that are a bit more advanced. If you're less familiar with the process, a clipper like G-Clip or Flatline may be helpful to you, as they give you a visual representation of what the plugin is doing to your mix. The main control on all clippers is the threshold. You want to bring this down until your clipper starts to round off the peak transients in your mix, which in turn will help to make things easier on your limiter, as it won't have to deal with any large audio peaks. Most of the time, you want this effect to be fairly transparent, so that there's almost no audible difference before and after the signal has been processed. Which brings me to the final plugin in this chain, a limiter. This is what you'll use to optimize the loudness level of your track and bring it up to a competitive volume. So finding a limiter that works for you and is easy to understand is going to be really important here. A few popular choices you could consider is the Pro L2 by FabFilter, Ozone 10's Maximizer, or Waves L2 Ultra Maximizer. If you're planning on sending your mix for mastering, you want to keep this plugin bypassed when exporting, but it's nice to be able to have an idea of what your mix will sound like once mastered beforehand. So add this to the final insert in your chain, and once you've applied the previous 3 plugins, you can run your mix through the limiting stage. A few important settings to note are the output ceiling of your limiter. On the Pro L2, you can find this in the bottom right of the plugin window. By default, this is set to 0, but you'll sometimes have to lower this anywhere from -0.1 to -0.5 to avoid intersample clipping distortion during playback. A nice trick to use with the Pro L2 is to hold down the Alt key on your keyboard when pushing up the gain slider, and this will match the output ceiling to the gain slider, so that you can clearly hear the effect that limiting is having on your track. So once you're happy with the amount of limiting, reset the output ceiling to the setting you had before, and you'll be left with a competitive sounding mix. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to get your mixes to sound like professional songs, I encourage you to check out Sage Audio's Mixing and Mastering membership. As a member, I have to say the experience is incredible. Just for signing up, you'll receive 10 free mastered songs per month with your own dedicated mastering engineer, unlimited mixing feedback, and access to Sage Audio University mixing and mastering courses, which include start to finish walkthrough sessions for various genres and 35 multi-track sessions for hands-on practice. This interconnected platform is supported by their thriving community and tight-knit network of audio engineers. Every day, I see and hear great wins in the membership from both new and seasoned engineers, noticing a huge improvement in their mixes and masters after joining. Right now, you can join the membership with a 70% discount, bringing the cost down to just $15 per month. So join today and create mixes that sound like professionally mixed and mastered songs.